Geography of Sudan. Sudan is the largest country in Africa, about 1/4 of the size of the United States, and stretches from the sub-Sahara to tropical Africa. It shares borders with 9 countries: Central African Republic, Chad, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Egypt, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Libya, and Uganda, and the Red Sea. The Nile River and its tributaries cut through the length of the country. Despite the presence of the major tributaries, lack of water and drought are major issues throughout the country, particularly in the north, and less than 7% of the country is arable. This lack of water and arable land has often put different people in conflict over the scarce resources available for farming and grazing. The capital, Khartoum, is situated at the conjunction of the White and Blue Nile rivers and is home to close to 3 million people. Literacy levels are low, especially for females, and health, education, and social services are very limited. At times of drought, many people suffer from famine and are severely limited in their ability to feed themselves. History of Sudan. The land that now constitutes Sudan has been settled for over 60,000 years. In ancient times, it was known as Nubia. The Egyptian dynasty dominated the Nile, and the northern parts of Sudan came under Egyptian control. Christian crusaders overwhelmed the area in the 6th century, but were eventually replaced by Arabs, who spread the Islamic faith. In the 16th century, the Fung conquered northern parts of Sudan, while different African tribal groups came to dominate the south. In 1874, Sudan once again came under the control of its neighbor to the north, Egypt. This was short-lived, as it became part of the British Empire in 1898. The British saw Sudan as being 2 very different regions and administered the north and south as 2 distinct entities. The north was Arabic and Muslim, and the south was African and animist. At the conclusion of World War I, there arose increased internal desires within these countries to seek independence, and the influence of the British Empire began to wane. The people of the Sudan continually pressed for independence. In 1956, the 2 regions, North and South, became the independent country of Sudan. Recent history. Sudan has been politically unstable throughout its entire history, with numerous governments, political coups, military dictatorships, and a lack of true representative government. It was often seen as the battleground in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. At times, it was controlled by a Marxist government and has been seen as supporting international terrorism. It has been the target of Western or U.S. economic sanctions and, in 1998, a cruise missile attack on the factory in the capital. Partly because of, and partly as a result of this lack of stability, Sudan has suffered through an almost continuous civil war throughout its time as an independent nation. There has been a constant conflict between the people of interest of the north and the south of the country. Prior to gaining independence, there was concern in the southern regions that they were going to be dominated by the north. Through political negotiations and then violence, people in the south fought against being included as part of a larger nation and fought to have greater power and wealth. Civil war broke out, pitting the Muslim, Arabic-speaking northern region against the southern region. While there were times when the war was less intense and others when it was more lethal, it extended from 1 year before the independence in 1955 and lasted until 1972. This left at least 1.5 million people killed and millions displaced, both internally within the country and to countries surrounding Sudan. This constant state of war left an already destitute country unable to harness its resources, either natural or human, as war destroys infrastructure and diverts money and attention away from the caring for people through education, health, or general welfare to security and weapons. The Civil War was finally ended when the Addis Ababa Peace Accord was signed in 1972. This allowed for the southern area to become a single administrative region with defined power and considerable autonomy in making many political decisions that related to their region. This agreement allowed the 2 regions to coexist in relative harmony with no major civil unrest. However, There was always a sense of mistrust between the people in the two regions. During the early 1980s, it was felt that the central government in the north was attempting to undermine the autonomy of the southern region. There were attempts to replace local administration and to implement Islamic laws and the Arabic language in the south. This was in complete violation of the peace accord, and these efforts were met with protest, both peaceful and violent, in the southern region. This conflict was also fueled by the discovery of deposits of oil in the southern area of the country, and disputes over how these resources would be exploited and how the revenue would be divided between the two regions. The Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLA, became the dominant rebel group to protect the people of the South from the soldiers of the North and to advocate for the creation of greater independence and a change to a more democratic form of government. They launched attacks against government troops and facilities. This second civil war, although some historians simply view it as an extension of the first, since it was driven by basically the same unresolved issues, broke out in 1983. Once again, people were killed, property, crops, and infrastructure were destroyed, millions of people fled the fighting, and the limited resources of the country were directed to war rather than the betterment of the people. If anything, this war was even more brutal and lethal than the first phase of the Civil War. It is estimated that by the time the conflict ended in 2005, that almost 2 million civilians were killed, and that over 5 million people were displaced, fleeing the war and its effects. In January 2005, a peace accord was signed that once again allowed the southern region considerable autonomy, a share of revenue from oil production, and the right to peacefully form a separate country in 6 years if the majority of the people wished that end. In some ways, this mirrored the previous agreement, with the further condition being that the consideration of total independence. The crisis in Darfur. In a country with limited resources, war and drought left it even more destitute. This became a crisis point in the western region of the country known as Darfur, bordering the country of Chad. This conflict had been simmering for years, with occasional flares of extreme violence. The majority of people in the region are from 3 African tribal groups: the Fur, Mazalit, and Zagawa. They tend to be mainly farmers living in small villages defined by tribe and extended family. The Arab groups often survived by tending to migratory flocks. It is important to note that both groups are primarily Muslim, so religion was not seen as a source of conflict. Instead, in a country which experiences periods of drought, these two groups often came into conflict for scarce resources. In 1998, a major episode of violence ensued in which over 60 Mazalit villages and 1 Arab village were burned to the ground, and hundreds of people were killed. The government attempted to quell these disturbances, but there was always a feeling that there was a bias against the African tribal members, and the Arabic-speaking people were supported by the government. The African people did not believe the government would support or protect them, or prosecute Arabs who were committing crimes against them. 2 militia groups, the Sudan Liberation Army and Justice and Equality Movement, acted to protect the interests of the tribal groups and to advocate for greater autonomy, or even independence from Khartoum. Outright conflict broke out in 2003. Government troops were sent in large numbers to the Darfur region. Roving gangs of militia known as the Janjaweed began attacking members of the tribal groups. These militias were supported and armed by the government. Villages were raided, burned to the ground, and people were killed, kidnapped, or raped. The militia members were often accompanied by government soldiers or given air support, providing reconnaissance, dropping bombs, or strafing civilians on the ground. International attention became focused on this conflict. It was identified by outside sources as being genocide, and the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution demanding that the government intervene and control the militia. Basically, the government denied all allegations against it, refused to restrain the militia, and would not allow the intervention of the United Nations troops to provide security and protection. The United Nations, often divided by the interests of member states, was not able to launch any sort of effective response to what was clearly seen as genocide in nature. Sudan did, however, originally allow a small number of troops from the African Union to be stationed in the country. These troops were poorly equipped, underfunded, and undersupplied, and were far too few in number to provide any form of security to the region. They were also given a mandate to only observe, but not intervene or protect civilians. They could document massacres, but not act to prevent them. In addition, attempts to provide humanitarian aid, food, water, and shelter to the displaced people were thwarted by the ongoing danger and warfare in the country and efforts by the government to not allow them to intervene. Violence and threats of violence toward international aid workers caused great restrictions in the ability of these non-governmental organizations to provide aid. As with many conflicts, the death toll, especially for children and elderly, was higher due to the effects of the conflict, disease, famine, and lack of shelter than those from the actual violence of conflict. Hundreds of thousands of civilians fled Sudan during this conflict, moving into Chad. This has had a destabilizing effect on Chad, a country as poor as Sudan, which does not have the resources or wealth to easily absorb large numbers of refugees. The Chadian government also believed that the Sudan government was supporting and arming rebel groups within its country, as well as allowing the Janjaweed militia to cross the border and attack Chad villages, steal cattle, and kill Chadian citizens. Throughout the ongoing conflict, there were continual attempts by the United Nations to advocate for the disarmament of the militia, allow aid to displaced people, and pursue a course of peace. The United Nations issued statements saying that there was a scorched earth campaign of ethnic cleansing, that it was the world's greatest humanitarian crisis, and comparing it to the genocide in Rwanda. In response, the Sudanese government consistently refused to acknowledge the extent of the crisis or its role in supporting the militia, or follow through on commitments to disarm them or protect aid workers and supplies. Attempts to broker a ceasefire continually faltered. It was only in 2007, 4 years after the conflict reached a boiling point, that the Sudanese government agreed to allow a joint UN and African Union force to be deployed in its country. This will provide a more comprehensive peacekeeping mission and allow for better distribution of humanitarian aid to help those who have been displaced, their villages and livelihood destroyed. This effort continues to be thwarted by political interests. It is estimated that well in excess of 400,000 people, mostly black Africans, were killed by the Janjaweed militia and the conditions they created, and over 3 million people have fled their homes to seek refuge from the killing. These people remain unable to return to their homes for fear that they will be killed, or because they simply have no place to return to.